golden elevator reflected the tears that Robert Jackson was trying to hide as he held the phone with hands that smelled like industrial disinfectant. On the other end of the line, the trembling voice of Tyler, his 12-year-old son, echoed through the empty hallway of the 15th floor. "Dad, the doctor said if I don't get the surgery before my birthday, I might never be able to walk right. You promised you'd get the money." Robert closed his eyes, feeling the weight of the last 6 years of double shifts, of saving every penny, of counting and recounting the $487 he was short of the $15,000 needed. It was 2:47 a.m. on a cold Tuesday in Cedar Rapids, and Robert was about to do something that would change not only his life, but that of a multimillionaire family he didn't even know existed. What happened in the next 17 minutes in that corporate building challenged everything Robert believed about destiny, justice, and the real value of a human life. But first, you need to understand why a man was willing to lose everything for a stranger. 3 floors below, Margaret Ashford, 78 years old, adjusted her reading glasses while going through contracts in a conference room that cost more per hour than Robert made in a month. She didn't know that in 15 minutes she would be clinically dead on an elevator floor, completely dependent on the calloused hands of a cleaner who had learned cardiopulmonary resuscitation, not in a professional course, but out of paternal desperation when his premature baby was fighting to survive in a neonatal ICU. Margaret also didn't know that her daughter Victoria, CEO of a technological empire worth $2.3 billion, was at that exact moment on a flight from Seattle to Iowa, worried about unanswered calls. Destiny has cruel ways of connecting lives that should never cross paths, and this story is about how an act of kindness can completely rewrite 2 existences. In 32 minutes, you'll discover why Robert Jackson was cleaning executive bathrooms at 3 in the morning, what Margaret Ashford was doing alone in that building, and how a sudden heart attack transformed an invisible cleaner into someone a multi-millionaire would call a hero. 15 hours earlier, Robert Jackson woke up on the worn-out couch of his rented house to the familiar sound of Tyler practicing physical therapy in the next room. 47 years of life had curved his shoulders and calloused his hands, but they couldn't break his determination to be the father Tyler deserved. The routine was military. Get up at 3 in the afternoon, prepare the protein lunch the nutritionist had recommended, take Tyler to the special school where therapists celebrated every small progress as a monumental victory. "Dad, today I walked to the door without holding onto the wall," Tyler announced proudly, and Robert felt that familiar pang in his chest, a mixture of pure joy and absolute terror of not being able to pay for the surgery that would make Tyler walk normally. Sarah, Tyler's mother, had disappeared when the cerebral palsy diagnosis transformed dreams of a perfect family into the reality of endless medical bills. "I didn't sign up for this, Robert. I wanted a normal son," were her last words before leaving on a cold March morning, leaving only a letter saying she couldn't live sacrificing everything for a child who might never be independent. Since then, Robert had built his entire existence around Tyler, transforming every penny into tangible hope. In the nightstand, he kept a coffee can where he religiously deposited $50 a month, sometimes $40 when the electric bill came high, sometimes $60 when he got overtime hours. Inside that can, $14,513 in crumpled bills represented 6 years of giving up everything. New clothes, cable TV, beer with friends he hadn't seen for so long they probably wouldn't even remember him. The job at Meridian Corporate Center paid $12 an hour, 50 cents above minimum wage, but it was the only job in Cedar Rapids that offered health insurance covering specialized therapies for Tyler. From 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., Robert cleaned 40 floors of offices where executives made in one day what it took him 3 months to put together. They barely noticed his presence, treating him like part of the furniture, but Robert preferred it that way. Invisibility meant safety, and safety meant Tyler continuing treatment. What Robert hadn't calculated was that this same invisibility would soon put him in a position where he'd need to choose between following rules or saving a life. Margaret Ashford arrived at the Meridian Center driving a black Mercedes worth more than the house where Robert was raising Tyler. But her worried expression revealed that money doesn't solve all of life's battles. At 78 years old, she maintained the elegant posture of someone who had built an empire alongside her husband, but also carried the fragility of someone who had been fighting alone for 3 years since Harold passed away. Victoria, her only daughter, had become an obsessive workaholic after her father's death, diving so deep into expanding Ashford technologies that she barely had time for weekly phone calls. Margaret understood. She herself had made similar choices decades ago, prioritizing business when Victoria was little. Now, ironically, she was there to resolve legal matters that Victoria considered too urgent to delegate. The contracts scattered around the 15th floor office contained stakes in dozens of properties throughout the Midwest, including the very Meridian Center where Robert worked. Margaret always insisted on personally checking important documents, a habit that irritated lawyers accustomed to clients who signed without reading. "Trust is built with details, not with haste," she used to say, quoting Harold. It was almost midnight when she politely waved to Robert at the reception, a small gesture that surprised a man accustomed to being treated like a ghost, and that in a few hours would gain deep meaning when their lives intertwined irreversibly. David Morrison arrived at work the next morning in an especially cruel mood, still irritated by the scolding he'd received from his father for not showing enough leadership at the family company. At 35 years old, Morrison had never worked with his hands, never felt the weight of real financial responsibility, never had to choose between paying the electric bill or buying medicine for a sick child. His position as facilities manager was a gift from his father, just like the MBA he'd never used and the downtown Cedar Rapids apartment he considered temporary until he could get something better in Chicago or New York. Morrison especially despised Robert Jackson, who represented everything about the working class that he found pathetic: the constant submission, excessive gratitude for poorly paid jobs, the obsession with children who would never amount to anything. During administrative meetings, Morrison made jokes about the cleaner who only talks about his disabled kid, comments that made other executives laugh nervously while avoiding confrontation. He had established rigid rules that were purposefully humiliating. Cleaning staff couldn't use executive elevators, couldn't enter restricted areas without supervision, couldn't interact with important visitors. "Hierarchy exists for a reason," Morrison repeated, unaware that these same rules would soon put him in a position where he'd have to choose between corporate protocol and basic human decency, definitively revealing the type of person he really was. It was exactly 2:23 a.m. when Robert reached the 15th floor and noticed something wrong. The executive elevator was stopped with doors open, a situation that violated security protocols he knew by heart. His paternal instincts, honed by years of caring for Tyler during epileptic seizures, triggered unconscious alerts. Robert hesitated at the entrance to the restricted area, remembering Morrison's severe warnings, but something in the absolute silence of the hallway deeply disturbed him. He approached carefully and found Margaret Ashford collapsed on the elevator floor, unconscious, with blue lips and no breathing. Time stopped. It was Tyler there on the floor. It was all those nights of terror in the neonatal ICU when monitors would set off alarms and nurses would run with emergency equipment. Robert knelt instinctively, checked for pulse in her neck. Nothing. Checked for breathing. Nothing. Margaret was in complete cardiac arrest, and every second without oxygen meant brain cells dying permanently. Robert looked around. He was alone, in a forbidden area, without supervision, with a stranger dying in his arms. He could run 3 floors to call security, follow protocols, save his job, and let Margaret die. Or he could do exactly what he would do if it were Tyler in that situation. "If it were my son there, I'd hope someone would break every rule in the world to save him," he murmured, positioning his hands on Margaret's chest and beginning chest compressions with technique he'd learned saving Tyler dozens of times. For 12 endless minutes, Robert alternated between 30 chest compressions and 2 mouth-to-mouth breaths, exactly as physical therapists had taught when Tyler was a premature baby connected to life support machines. Sweat ran down his face as he mentally counted each compression, feeling Margaret's ribs flexing under the pressure necessary to manually pump blood. His arms ached, but he thought about Tyler sleeping at home, about the surgery they needed to pay for, about the $14,513 saved with so much sacrifice. He also thought about Sarah, who had abandoned him, calling him too obsessive with their son. "Maybe I am obsessive," Robert murmured between compressions, "but that's how real fathers act when someone needs help." His mind automatically calculated, without this job, Tyler would lose physical therapy, health insurance, special school. The surgery would be postponed indefinitely, possibly forever. But looking at Margaret, someone who could be Tyler's grandmother, someone who had smiled at him politely a few hours before, Robert knew there was no real choice. Values aren't negotiable when human life is at stake. In the 12th minute, Margaret coughed violently and opened her eyes, breathing irregularly, but definitely alive. Robert held her trembling hand, whispering words of comfort exactly as he did with Tyler after seizures. "It's all right now. You're safe. Help is coming." He didn't know he had just saved the mother of Iowa's most powerful woman. The next morning, David Morrison reviewed security footage with sadistic satisfaction that he tried to disguise as professional zeal. There was all the evidence he needed. Robert Jackson violating a restricted area, touching a visitor without authorization, causing unnecessary disruption that could result in lawsuits. Morrison had always despised employees like Robert, men who put emotion above protocol, who thought that doing the right thing justified disobedience. "Finally, I can get rid of this guy," he thought, already preparing termination documents for just cause. When Robert arrived at 10 p.m., Morrison intercepted him at the reception with a smile that mixed triumph and cruelty. "Jackson, my office. Now." The room smelled of expensive leather and inherited arrogance, with framed diplomas from universities Robert didn't even know existed. Morrison made a point of sitting behind the imposing desk, forcing Robert to stand like a child being scolded. "You violated serious protocol last night. The executive area is strictly prohibited for cleaning staff without direct supervision." Robert tried to explain. "Mr. Morrison, the lady was dying. I just did what anyone would. What you did was disobey direct orders and put the company at legal risk. I'm firing you for just cause. No advance notice, no severance, no references." The words hit Robert like physical punches. Without this job, how would he keep Tyler in special school? How would he pay for medications that cost $300 monthly? The $14,513 saved would last 4 months at most. Robert felt tears burning his eyes, not from personal humiliation, but from the devastating image of Tyler asking why he couldn't do physical therapy anymore. "Mr. Morrison, I have a son with cerebral palsy. I need this job to pay for his treatment. Please give me another chance." Morrison interrupted with calculated coldness. "Personal problems aren't an excuse for insubordination. You should have thought about the consequences before playing hero." The cruelty in Morrison's voice revealed genuine pleasure in destroying the life of someone he considered inferior. "You have 15 minutes to collect your belongings and leave the building. Security will escort you to make sure you don't take anything that isn't yours." Robert imagined coming home, waking Tyler to explain that Daddy had lost his job because he saved a life. How would he explain to a 12-year-old boy that the world punishes kindness? How would he look into his son's eyes and admit he couldn't even protect his own job? While emptying his locker, Robert thought about Sarah, who had called him an idealistic dreamer before leaving. Maybe she was right. Maybe men like him were anachronistic in a world where protocols mattered more than people. 3 floors above, a very different conversation was happening. Victoria Ashford had flown from Seattle as soon as she heard about her mother's heart attack, and now wanted to understand exactly who had saved Margaret from certain death. What she would discover would change not only Robert's destiny, but her own perspective on power, privilege, and social responsibility. Victoria Ashford had built a $2.3 billion empire by controlling every variable, anticipating every move, never leaving anything to chance. But sitting beside the hospital bed where Margaret was resting, she felt something money couldn't buy. Absolute gratitude for a stranger who had risked everything to save her mother. "The cleaner saved me, dear," Margaret explained with a voice still weak. "That kind man did chest compressions for 12 minutes straight. If it weren't for him..." Victoria knew the numbers. 12 minutes of CPR meant the difference between normal life and permanent brain damage. It meant the difference between having a mother or becoming an orphan at 42 years old. "I want to meet this man, Mom. I want to thank him personally." At the Meridian Center, Victoria discovered that Robert was being fired exactly for saving her. The irony was grotesque. A man loses his job for demonstrating basic humanity. Morrison, nervous in the presence of the most powerful woman he'd ever encountered, tried to justify. "Mrs. Ashford, I understand your gratitude, but rules exist for important legal reasons." Victoria cut him off with coldness that would melt steel. "Let me understand. You're firing the man who saved my mother because he followed fundamental human instinct." Morrison stammered about corporate responsibilities and procedures, but Victoria was no longer listening. She was thinking about her own journey, how she'd built an empire because someone needed to care for her widowed mother, how every difficult decision always came back to family. Morrison represented everything she despised: power without wisdom, privilege without gratitude, authority without compassion. "Mr. Morrison, you're fired. Immediately." Victoria delivered the words with icy satisfaction, watching shock and indignation spread across the face of the man who moments before had flaunted absolute authority. "But, Mrs. Ashford, I was following established protocols. Protocols that punish kindness don't deserve to exist. You have 1 hour to clean out your desk." The revenge was sweet, but Victoria knew that negative justice wasn't enough. Robert Jackson deserved positive recognition for what he really was: a hero who risked his family's livelihood to save a stranger. In the parking lot, Robert was holding a box with personal belongings, trying to find courage to call Tyler, when a black Mercedes stopped beside him. Victoria got out with the natural elegance of someone who controls boardrooms, but her eyes showed genuine vulnerability. "Are you Robert Jackson?" He nodded, confused, still processing the termination. "I'm Victoria Ashford. You saved my mother last night." Robert felt the world spinning. This impeccably dressed woman was the elderly lady's daughter. "How is she? Please tell me she's okay." Victoria smiled, recognizing the kindness Margaret had described. "She's perfect, thanks exclusively to you. Doctors said that without immediate CPR she would have died or suffered irreversible brain damage." Victoria observed the box in Robert's hands and felt familiar anger, the same she felt when unjust systems punished good people. "I heard you were fired for saving her. That's morally unacceptable and personally offensive." Robert lowered his eyes, ashamed. "I broke company rules, ma'am. I understand that. The only rules that matter are those of human decency, and you followed them perfectly." Victoria had spent the last 2 hours investigating Robert Jackson, not out of distrust, but out of curiosity about the type of man who would risk his career to save a stranger. What she discovered moved her deeply. A single father raising a son with cerebral palsy, working double shifts for 12 years, saving every penny for surgery that would change the boy's life forever. It was like looking in a mirror of her own struggle to balance professional success with family responsibility. "Robert, I want to make you a proposal. My company is opening a branch in Cedar Rapids, and I need a director of security and wellness. Starting salary of $75,000 annually. Premium health plan including total coverage for specialized therapies and surgical procedures." Robert felt his legs weaken. It was more money than he'd seen in his entire life, more than he'd dreamed possible. "Mrs. Ashford, I'm just a cleaner with a high school education. You're a man who put human life above corporate protocols when nobody was watching. That's exactly the type of leader I'm looking for. Someone with a functioning moral compass." Victoria extended her business card. "Think of this as an investment in proven character. My company needs people who do the right thing regardless of personal consequences." 6 months later, Robert Jackson entered the Ashford Technologies office wearing a suit for the first time in his life, still getting used to the nameplate on his door: Director of Corporate Security and Wellness. Tyler had undergone corrective surgery with the country's best specialists, walked without support, spoke clearly, progress that surprised even the most experienced doctors. "Dad, you really are the strongest man in the world," Tyler said the day he visited his father's new office, and Robert finally felt he deserved the title. Margaret Ashford visited frequently, bringing homemade cookies and stories about when Victoria was little. She and Robert discovered they had much in common about raising children with absolute determination. The friendship between them grew naturally, based on mutual respect and shared experiences of paternal sacrifice. Victoria had offered Robert a stake in the company and a new house in an upscale neighborhood, but he asked for something different: a program to hire and train other single fathers from the working-class community, giving them opportunities he himself had never had. "Kindness multiplies when it finds fertile ground," Robert always said, remembering that night in the elevator when he chose to save a life, even though it cost everything he had. The program had already employed 17 men in similar situations, creating waves of change that spread through the community like circles in water. Sarah called once, wanting to reconnect, now that Robert had money, but he politely declined. Some bridges, once burned, should remain that way. 2 years later, Robert was on the stage of the Cedar Rapids Convention Center, receiving the Municipal Citizen of the Year award from the hands of the mayor, who a few years earlier wouldn't have known his name. Tyler, now walking normally and speaking with perfect clarity, applauded from the front row next to Margaret, who had become the honorary grandmother he'd never had. Robert's social program had already employed 43 single fathers, creating a support network that transformed entire families. Victoria watched from the back of the auditorium, smiling discreetly as she observed the multiplier effect of a decision made at 2:47 a.m. on a cold morning. During his speech, Robert talked about Tyler, about Margaret, about second chances and first impressions. "Sometimes doing the right thing seems like the hardest decision we can make," he said, his voice echoing through the packed auditorium. "But I discovered that kindness isn't sacrifice. It's investment. Investment in a society where character matters more than protocol, where humanity beats bureaucracy." The audience rose in an ovation that lasted 3 minutes, but Robert only had eyes for Tyler, who was holding a handwritten sign. "My dad saved 2 lives that night, Mrs. Margaret's and our whole family's." That night, while Tyler slept in a room decorated with swimming trophies he never imagined he could win, Robert looked out the window of the new house that Victoria had insisted on buying for them. The neighborhood was quiet, safe, full of families who invested in their children's future without counting every penny. He thought about the impossible journey of the last 2 years, from invisible cleaner to respected director, from desperate father to community role model. More importantly, he thought about Tyler growing up in a world where kindness was rewarded, where doing the right thing had positive consequences. The phone rang. Victoria, as always, checking if they needed anything. The friendship between them had evolved into something like chosen family, based on shared values about responsibility and gratitude. "Thank you again for everything," Robert said. "Stop thanking me," Victoria laughed. "You gave me my mother back. I just gave you an opportunity. The rest was your merit." After he hung up, Robert went back to Tyler's room, adjusted his blanket, and whispered a promise he'd made 1,000 times. "Daddy will always do the right thing, no matter what it costs." The difference now was that he lived in a world where kindness had a fair price, where saving lives was worth more than following rules.